welcome, Karush, to this conversation between the two of us. I don't know that it's Sense Based Podcast or Karush Kailu Podcast, which is your podcast, but it's somehow like meeting in between the two podcasts. And this is a really interesting conversation because you started your podcast right at the same time as I was making my first foray. I remember both at that time we were very interested in what was going on with Joe Rogan experience, and yeah, we've both sort of been on that track, different tracks, over the last, gosh, it must be 3 years since we were doing those like practice conversations.
Yes,
Before we even had podcasts, we were doing some dry runs and talking and recording. So yeah, with that long, slightly rambling introduction, welcome Karush to the conversation space.
thank you for initiating this conversation, Jacob. You're one of my good friends that I gained from school at UCSD. And those initial conversations are actually a couple of the single digit Purush Koilu podcast episodes. It was formerly named This Is It Podcasting, and I decided to change that. I think those podcasts I got up to somewhere around 7 or 8. They were produced in 2019, and then huge hiatus, just even before COVID became a serious dilemma within the Western world. I stopped that practice. And then somewhere at the end of 2020, I regained the practice, and it's been interesting. Definitely, I think mostly positive. I would say mostly positive.
It's
It's
interesting.
not what continue.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in because it's really interesting that you describe it as a practice.
Yes, it is a practice. And it's I mean, people have asked me, it's like, I don't know. People ask me, is this like your primary source of income or what? And it's like, no, I have multiple sources of income, and this is something that I enjoy doing and I produce, and it is very rewarding. I mean, I've connected with people. Some people love to speak, like yourself and myself, and several of our friends who've been on my podcast. And, there are people who are willing to podcast, 2-3 times a year. And there are others, who, for whatever reason, maybe it's because they don't want to podcast with me necessarily, which is understandable, or they don't feel comfortable speaking in public, which I also understand. I release clips of myself speaking, and there are several times, today especially, where if you listen to what I say grammatically, it's not correct, and it doesn't necessarily flow that well. I think the overall subject matter and the way I'm attempting to communicate my thinking there is inherently not inherent to me. It is, but is people are able to decipher that from the speech. But when you actually listen to the speech, it isn't necessarily, there's like sense of grammar that's off, and I can see this. I'm listening to the entire clip. It's a 1 minute long clip, and I can hear myself speaking, and it's like, wow, that didn't make sense. Or even like when we are attempting to communicate something that maybe we didn't intend to actually bring up, but it comes out, and we struggle with that. I'm not sure what to say or how to continue, but that's not easy to handle or even to move a conversation. And I know a lot of people, and so when we try and speak and communicate, it's not easy to pick the specific vernacular, the specific diction that we that actually communicates what we're thinking. It takes a lot of, I've come to realize, reading, writing, speaking with other people, listening to other people, things that I didn't value for a long time. I didn't value these things, and I've just come to realize they're invaluable, and continuing the practice of being a part of the community and communicating with others is, you know, it's empowering. And I think the first person that I heard speak in that term and communicate that subject matter to me was Jordan Peterson. It was this clip, he has many clips of people create clips of him, and he posts sayings, speeches that he puts on himself. And he says at one point, I'm sure you've seen this, and many people have, that the purpose of reading and writing isn't to get good grades, it's to become a good communicator, and it's to be able to be powerful with our speech and our word. And that is the reason that we read and we write. And that is something that I value much, much more than I did. My traditional background in education is engineering and mathematics. So, and that hasn't gone away. I still love engineering and mathematics, and physics too. I mean, if anything, physics, it's a very, very powerful subject matter. And so is many of the STEM disciplines. But even in diving into these disciplines, it requires a lot of reading, a lot of being able to communicate with subject matter experts, people who know more than you. And there's the challenges that are presented today in the engineering realm are so great that it's very difficult for these tech geniuses to come out. I'm not going to say that it's not going to happen. I hope they come out. These Elon Musks, these Mark Zuckerbergs, these Jack Dorseys, I'm not sure the Google CEO's names and the Google founders' names, but whoever they are, or what is the Apple, the creator of Apple. Steve Jobs.
Yeah.
Yes. I mean, I think the startup mentality can be very powerful, but a lot of the challenges today, even for startups and people that want to progress, are going to require being able to communicate, being able to be empathetic with other people that you want to work with, being, a lot of it's empathy and understanding where they come from, and them making sure they understand where you come from, because we spoke about it earlier there. We spoke about it before the recording, that some people, you were saying how to speak and how to maintain a sort of dialect with an individual. I don't know if I'm giving your words actual correct weight. And then I made the argument that some people have a very difficult time being empathetic with others.
Yes.
And it's hard to communicate with them. And I had a program manager on my podcast, and his whole thing, for he was managing a lot of people, and one of his pillars on, he assumed if you're an engineer, you're going to know engineering. If you're a financial person, you're going to know something about finances. If you're a uh, technical lead, you're going to know something about that. But if you're not able to work with people, that's something that's nearly unfixable. And so,
Yeah, I think you've zeroed in on something super important there, and I also want to like shift gears a little bit because there were so many things at the beginning of your journey there that was just like so much in it. I was like, holy shit, like a whole world of um, interesting life developments occurred in that early part that I wanted to sort of draw out.
yes,
But this thing about, difficult conversations, challenging conversations is really like live for me right now. It's like where the journey's been taking me in terms of the practice of dialogue. So definitely want to talk about that. But um, yeah, it was interesting hearing you talk about finding language for what's going on in your head, like just the very basic process of like thought, experience, and then bringing through into words, and also words that, what, not just words for the sake of words, but words that then meet the other person's understanding, which it seems like your journey with the podcast somehow taking you continuously up to the edges of something. At least in my own journey, I felt that continually. Like there is this boundary, this edge of understanding, of expressing, of communicating that I'm being brought to. And like each conversation has the potential to take me to that sort of edge, and then in that edge space then I can like do the messy work of saying something new potentially. um, but I found that with a really um, with a intentional space and with a dialogue partner who's also practiced, the quality of the space itself can make it easier for the things to flow out and through. And so it's not really that I'm like, there's a feeling that I'm not the one who's like the genius for saying the thing that I said. It's more that I'm coming into relationship with the flow or wisdom that's already there, and then the thing will just come out. And so yeah, and also another like interesting distinction between the podcast journeys we went on is that I sort of went out into this completely other sphere, I guess, this other like not an existing social sphere, like something that was just kind of emerging and not really a coherent network yet. And your podcast has become like the official UCSD SAE alumni network channel. I mean, I know you talk with a lot of other professionals and you're talking to a lot of like real on the ground people in San Diego, business people, uh, and various other professions. But it's interesting that you've kind of um, you've really drawn on that resource and you've created this like space that sort of keeps the energy of that social community alive by just through you like doing the work of reaching out, having these conversations. Like I get to see that. I get to see like, oh, here's Karush with Paul or Eden or like some of the alumni that I never met. um, That's an interesting dynamic as well. But of course, it is like it's more in continuity with the relationships that you had before. And so when the relationship's already established, it can be more challenging to take it into a new terrain or a new direction, than say like meeting a new person. Then you're actually just being met for the first time, and you get to sort of bring forward yourself. Like each person I meet somehow discloses me in a new way. Like I'm not the same person. I'm a slightly different person through each person's eyes.
Yes. It's traveling makes all of this very obvious. Traveling to places with a high international diversity. It's, or even just somewhere where we weren't born and raised for most of our childhood. It's the importance, yes, we get to introduce ourselves every single day, to someone new and someone who has a different context on life, someone who doesn't necessarily know our context of life. And you're right, those podcasts with new individuals are people that I've never met before. There is a lot to gain. And I'm not sure if you've heard of the term weak connections. I read a book maybe last year. I think it had something to do with our 20s, the 20s, and individuals, what they do in their 20s shapes them for the rest of their life. And in that book, I believe the author brings up the idea of weak connections, how weak connections are very powerful because they open up avenues that were completely closed off to us, whereas strong connections bring, more or less, they're very supportive. I brought this up to a friend last week, and he said, yeah, strong connection. He said he agrees, but he also made the point that strong connections, I didn't have this point, are very supportive and very critical for supporting an individual, but they don't. But the point of the book, why, I think the title was something like why our 20s matter, was that weak connections open up avenues to our life that we couldn't even fathom or see before, or would have no access to without tapping into those connections. So I am, personally grateful for weak connections and try to tap into those more, because strong connections are important, and I am very grateful for the people who I am very close to. They're very important to me because without them, they're very important for everyone. It's a critical foundation to most values in every single society ever. To highly value strong connections like family, and eventually I think those do reach out to your neighbor and your friends. But weak connections are valuable too. They open up avenues. They bring up things that were seemingly, like I said, impossible to reach. And you seem to have tapped into that, and that has been the backbone of your podcast, I'm sure. How has that journey been for you? With my experience, people are a bit more hesitant to, at least for me, getting rejected isn't easy when you ask someone to be on your podcast and they say either they can't now or they will maybe some other time, or they just won't, they just aren't interested or can't. And it's not easy to take, but it's really not, I'm not sure. After I make this comment, I would be very interested to hear what you have to say. But as far as getting rejected, it doesn't feel good. I can't deny that. It feels not, it feels it feels bad.
Yeah.
But it's real. I have to remind myself this, that even if it feels bad, it's not a big deal. It's a very light-hearted deal. And once someone says hopefully respectful, but most people are respectful, because I think you and I both are pretty respectful to anyone who we'd like to be on our podcast or speak with, that they're not interested, then just walk away. But it's definitely difficult to get rejected, but I try to remind myself that it's not a big deal.
I can definitely resonate with this, Karush. It's another really interesting aspect of this that, well, first I wanted to sort of mirror back what you're talking about with the weak and strong connections, because that was interesting. And what I was hearing in that, I sort of felt like the weak and strong weren't like the relevant words for it, at least how I was hearing it. It was kind of like serendipitous, or like new unknown connections, and then like stronger ongoing relationships, like the fabric of your life kind of thing.
Yes.
And I do feel that the ideal is somehow to have both of those going on, to be like having new conversations with people regularly, is definitely an opening and a practice in itself. But then, like, yeah, those relationships that are kind of traveling with you through time are what makes up your life ultimately, and what really, shows you what's important, where the value is, where the love is, and so on. However, the distinction there is that it's in the new relationships that something surprising happens, and in the existing relationships, it's kind of stable or the same. And my experience over the last year and a half, 2 years, has been so much change, so much transformation, both in myself and in relationship to the world at the same time, that the best relationships I've discovered have been the ones that are themselves with other people who are also having that sort of experience. And so the art of it has been having relationships where both people are changing over time, and then each conversation is somehow, you have the familiarity, but you're also like open to the newness, that something like, the person is somehow still mysterious, there's still something unknown, going on. And insofar as I'm open to that or listening to that, I could also be inviting that in somebody who, feels like there's no mystery in life at all. In the difficult conversation end of things that we were talking about, it feels to me that somehow the practice that I'm doing with the most devoted, intentional dialogue partners, where we're really exploring transformative dialogue, having this experience of flowing with not knowing and being really in presence, with one another, that gives me skills that I take out and have recently found a lot of use in really difficult conversations with. Um, I had this week where I just had like all the difficult conversations coming up, like all the family relationships, all of the kinds of conversations that make me feel anxious and ambivalent, and like I'm sort of thinking and planning, trying to like plan for it so that I can better navigate it, which is usually a sign that you're anxious going into it. And I had all of those, and it was amazing to like go into that and have it kind of work out, at least to the degree that I no longer was feeling anxious about it or ambivalent. Like I felt like, okay, I've confronted whatever I was afraid of in this. And, the other person might not have transformed, but I have reached a place where there's one less thing in my life that is like way out of balance, way out of, something that is ultimately causing me anxiety, causing me conflict. I'm in right relationship to that, even without the other person changing, just to have like been there and been able to show up as myself, have my boundaries and speak my truth. So that's been really, really cool. I don't know if you've had experiences of like your podcast practice somehow bleeding out into personal conversations and just like the rest of your life with professional engagements and so on.
I try to avoid it. It sometimes occurs, but I try my hardest to avoid it. We can't be coy with what we're doing. We're doing live recordings. And for almost every podcaster I listen to closely, I know a decent amount about them. Joe Rogan, Lex Friedman, Tim Ferriss, Russ Roberts. You know a decent amount of those, who those people are. There are a couple that I listen to that are much less, less open. One, for example, is, I'm not sure, I forgot, Darknet Diaries. It's the most popular cybersecurity podcast in the world. And the creator, I forget his name, and that's probably what he wants, is very, he doesn't, he speaks on every podcast. He, is very, engaging. He has I wouldn't say an agenda, but he has a sort of view on the subject matter, which is usually a cybersecurity dilemma within some point, or even, one that may be occurring in the future. And he definitely has a view on it, and he integrates his view with the podcast and the story. And, he's a cybersecurity professional, and he preaches how he believes he should be more private, and how that is, something that he values is privacy. With that being said, I think we can see with the way that, at least this is my sort of thinking, with the way that industry is going, with the way that social media is influencing the market and influencing people's decision making on purchases. Gary Vaynerchuk makes this statement: people don't care about what you wear, what you listen to, they care about what you purchase, what you're buying. And that seems, at first, when you hear that, kind of ridiculous. Like, what? Why does that matter? But really, it does matter. people, whenever Elon Musk, what Elon Musk has done in the last couple of years through Tesla and just engaging in the social media realm, he has made so much money by just engaging in the social media realm. This is my opinion. I don't know if this, I mean, obviously he has Tesla and he has SpaceX, but those companies have, I don't know, and he created PayPal also. But, and this is a very big example that there is a lot of authority established by him continuing to engage on social media. And I think it's one of the reasons that he is so popular. I mean, granted, he's created two companies that people just resonate with because they're so amazing. They're so valuable to the human, to progress. A company that produces really sick cars that are completely electrical. That's awesome. He was the first one. It's incredible that he did that. Honestly, when I spoke earlier how it's very difficult for people to start up because there's a huge basis of industry already established, he made a lot of money on a previous product. He got rich off of creating PayPal, and then he got out of PayPal and invested in much these other resources. And PayPal is huge now, but he's not a part of PayPal. But he literally was one of the creators, I believe. And then he got out and started doing something that he really loved, which is what he thought was good for humanity. And I think there's a couple of things. And then, through that with his business, he's also been able to, continually engage in social media and become very popular and continually, I mean, do you follow him on Twitter by chance?
I don't follow him, but I see him all the time. It's kind of hard not to see him because so many people that I know favoriting and so on. Yeah.
Exactly. And he makes so much money. And when he puts money into Twitter, the value of Twitter goes up. Tesla, the value of Tesla, is the price of Tesla stock is by the standards of, if you listen to Warren Buffett and I'm sorry, yes, Warren Buffett, if you listen to his way of thinking, it's a very traditional way of thinking. Tesla stock, and you check the Tesla balance sheets, are dramatically overpriced. But people don't care because Elon Musk is the owner and he's just so charismatic that, and this is what he believes in, that people believe in him and they're going to invest within him. Engaging with people online, I think, is going to be huge. Creating a form of authority is huge. People are getting very wealthy and creating networks by continually establishing a sense of, I'm not sure what the word is, but I wrote an article about it. Just legitimacy. This brings a form, when people meet Jacob Kishere, or when people meet Karush Koilu, there is literally a ledger online of our thinking, our network, our, just all of it. And if we can, if we stop, that ledger will almost certainly lose value. But if we continue to learn, upgrade our way of thinking, continue to upgrade our network, and losing connections in a network is very difficult to comprehend. Or even just, if we want to gain new connections, that means we might have to let go of things. And letting go of things is, for me, has been very difficult. In order to pick something up that we find of high value, we usually have to let something go that is dragging us. And that's not always obvious. And even if it is obvious, an elephant in the room that a lot of people, including myself, don't want to address. And because it's just difficult for some reason, our, whatever it is, finds that one subject matter, that one challenge very challenging. And I'm not sure where I was
Yeah.
going with
No,
that.
I think you've arrived at like a fundamental reality somehow, like something very core. And it's interesting how you kind of you went on this like arc through Elon Musk and Twitter and what's the significance of Elon Musk, and then how it kind of comes back to how you're interpreting that for yourself and your own navigation, and then gradually it just like arrived naturally at something um more philosophical in a way, something that's about the fundamental coupling between you and world, basically. And I totally agree, and I'm just remembering what you were saying about like the rejection and like reaching out and having it not work out. And this is also very good to reflect on for me. The podcast, you see the output, but there's all these other things that go into it, such as editing,
Yes.
but also, you know, the instrument that's sensing like, oh, what's interesting, what's not interesting, who am I drawn to, who am I not drawn to, and then thinking about how I can best reach out to that person. Where are the convergences of interest? What's the possibility that I'm feeling into? And for me, being in such an intense transformation during the podcast journey, I've had the experience of like meeting people that were like I really looked up to, who were like mentors or whatever, and then having an interaction with them, and then a year and a half goes by and I'm a totally changed person, but I have to be like at peace with the reality that like where I'm at is kind of, for that person, going to be frozen where we last spoke in a certain sense. Um, and so that, yeah, that again brings it back to like, you know, each new meeting is the possibility of like me coming forward more fully or more truly with that person.
I think for me, one of the most obvious, when I've witnessed this in people that we've listened to over the last 7 years, is Sam Harris and Joe Rogan. I feel 5 years ago, Joe Rogan and Sam Harris were on a very similar path. And in the last 3 or 4 years, that path has completely, I wouldn't say completely, that's not fair at all. They both have very similar thought patterns in many things, but there has been a fork in that road between those two, where Joe Rogan really looked up to Sam Harris, when he first started the podcast, when Sam Harris was writing those, several of his very popular books. And now Joe Rogan is on a very different path in a very different community, let go of a lot of connections he had. And, I don't know the relationship in any sense of the word. All I can see is what's online. But it's, obvious that the networks have changed, because, Sam Harris will post this, Joe Rogan, there was huge Joe Rogan controversies, I would say 3 or 4 months ago, right before 3 months ago, right before the Ukrainian outbreak. Joe Rogan was a huge topic in America. And, Sam Harris, made these comments that's made it seem as though on Twitter that they hadn't interacted in a long time. That just, I won't even bring any other, whatever Sam Harris was saying, but it was obvious by those tweets that Sam and Joe hadn't interacted for quite a bit of time. But to me, to you, for a couple years, they were very tightly connected within a network of people that were speaking. And we all associated them, not, I wouldn't say necessarily the same. There were a lot of people who really love Sam Harris, who just, Joe Rogan, like you said, he was one of Sam Harris's idols. But that's something where it was very obvious to me, is what
Yeah.
you brought up there.
I mean, that was the intellectual dark web
Yes.
time. And I remember when I was a student, I wrote a paper about the intellectual dark web, and it was like the first one written about it. And then later on, like 6 months later, it was like New York Times, Barry Weiss wrote a piece about it, and suddenly it was like blowing up. And I was super excited by that, and that was sort of, part of my journey as well. And then I also sort of found myself going off, and you do naturally, like, when your relationship with a certain thinker feels like it's dried up, or they have sort of reached a plateau, which is my feeling in relationship to Sam Harris, who I did have a real learning relationship with for many years. There was a point at which I felt like Sam Harris is just like, he's arrived, and I'm more interested in people who are still on the journey. And so then I was drawn more to John Vervaeke and many people in this, some people called it like intellectual deep web, liminal web. There's a bunch of different words for this
Community.
space, this like network of many different communities and conversations. But for me, it's really important that it's evolving. And I mean, you respect privacy, where privacy is everybody's individual right. There's something important and sacred about it. It certainly shouldn't be taken away from people. It's something that we voluntarily choose to speak things in the public domain, and for me, part of the project of integration has been having a sort of greater coherence between my private self and my public self. And there's a sense within me that somehow that can, like, having more coherence in that channel means that I become more powerful as a channel, because I won't have to be thinking about this kind of code switching of fragmented identities that made up a lot of culture up until very recently, like really severely fragmented worlds and contexts. And there's something to be said for that as well. But my movement has been to try and somehow be adaptive to each context and be able to show up as me. So I don't have to be the same style of Jacob. I don't have to tell the same stories or even express myself in exactly the same way, as long as feel like I'm in integrity with myself in whatever that context is. And as you spoke to, that letting go of and opening to simultaneously seem to make up us, and like what's possible for us. And we could like somehow be opening to all these new possibilities and potentialities, but then there's like one thing that we won't address, let go of, whether it's confront, let go of, I should say, because I feel there's an ordering to it. Whether it's within ourselves or it's between us and the world, e.g., a relationship. So, yeah, for me, this is very tied up with boundaries as like a deeply understood practice, which has been so like essential to the survival and development and evolution of my dialogue, has been like having a skillfulness with that, because otherwise my energies, my capacity to do the work completely go out the window if I don't have that ability to sort of stay in coherence with myself and with the other person. Man, having even one relationship in your field, in your life, where you really feel that's totally out of whack, can like hold back possibility for the whole system. And this is something that me and Hannah talk about a lot, is like, one, when you can sort of, I think of it sort of like roots of a tree sometimes, and like one stuck relationship within oneself, one stuck trauma is a root of the tree that is sort of cut off. And when you can open it, suddenly like energy can flow through that and into the whole, and then that will then go out into, who knows what. It's opening possibility in a more general sense.
Sometimes it's massive amounts of energy. Like sometimes it's the difference between being happy with who we are and not being happy with who we are. And that's usually, for me, it's just acting in accordance with, I think you said this, acting in, you said, I believe, speaking in accordance with, the context of the situation, but also acting in accordance with it. And sometimes it's just this one thing, someone said today to me, I heard you're killing it. I heard you're killing it with the engineering. And it's like, yeah, my career is going well. There's a lot of things. A career is good. Career is important, but there's a lot of things outside of my career that matter, and they matter a lot. And when they're ignored, they matter a lot more than how, my career, my ability to say, I'm with this company. I value my career, my employers, the people who pay me, my customers. I value them a lot. And, that's why I try and do good and do well in my career. But man, if, like you said, we have this root and that root isn't our career, the amount of energy that cutting that root off and having it severed. And when we want to stop the axe, that's like us, I don't know, axing that root down. It's trying to grow. It's trying to become stronger. But then something we do or say or just the way of thinking is just like an axe, keeping it down. So when we finally decide, all right, I'm going to stop axing my own root, then it will be very weak and it will need time to grow and to be able to bring in that energy source, those nutrients that we, it's to say need is not necessarily valuable, because, I don't know what we need, but that we will find extremely valuable and extremely replenishing and helping aid other vulnerabilities. And it's really, really difficult to stop axing ourselves, to stop axing those roots, and to actually gain access into those nutrient sources, energy sources.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's somehow, as you're speaking about it, I'm just recognizing how important my close relationships, particularly like female cohabiting relationships, have been to, um, the make or break of that. Just by virtue of having this person who you are in this ongoing, constant dialogue with, if that dialogue can be, at least slightly oriented towards becoming more conscious, then that over time opens up so much possibility just through the day to day reflecting back and forth of these things, like noticing somebody who's noticing your little behaviors and who you're noticing theirs, who you can like somehow respond to that, bring that into the aware area, that's like bring that into the conscious awareness. um, that is really powerful. And it's not easy, I'll say
No.
that. It's the we talked about my engagement before. I've been engaged since last July, hallelujah. But
Oh yeah.
the the journey has been, triggering all the things that could be triggered. Like, that's how those things become known a lot of the time. Sometimes, through the skillfulness of our dialogue, we're just opening things up and realizing things in this beautiful, exciting way. But other times it really is like whatever that thing is, whatever that maladaptive, unconscious thing, it has to be played out in order for us to like meet it. And my sort of one of my deepest beliefs about the mind and about reality itself is that in some sense our unconscious wants to be made conscious. And so if we have, say, like an unconscious behavior, a maladaptive behavior, it will sort of make itself known in reality in all these different ways and continue to do so until we wake up to it. The same way with relationships, toxic dynamics, like, oh, you broke up with this person and then you somehow ended up with somebody who's like so strikingly similar in all these different ways, and suddenly you're like reconnecting with some really deep sort of mirror pattern in the other person. Yeah, that is like so deeply true of how reality works for me, is that I meet that again and I get the opportunity to do something slightly different with it than I did the time before. And that is a lot of the healing process for me as well. So yeah.
Yes. I feel our relationship, has had dramatic changes since the outbreak of COVID, for the better, probably. At least I think. What do you think? And I can speak on why. But
And I'm happy for you to. It's kind of a very open field, and I wonder, like,
yes,
what in particular, what.
just, you know, I think an example is, at least for me, I had a lot of growth to do when we were speaking together, had a lot of expectations of people, had, I wasn't, I don't know what to say, but just not as kind and not as forgiving as I think I could be, but a lot of growth in these last 2 years. And I think we've both spoken about how people who don't hold empathy, they're very difficult to work with, but they also don't grow. They don't, even for someone who doesn't empathize with others, yes, they may distress others. And not to say that I'm the most empathetic person here in the world, or to say I'm empathetic at all, but it is something that I value, and I attempt to maintain a sense of empathy within my relations with people. But for people who don't value that, who don't see it or attempt to maintain a sense of empathy, there's a lot of growth that isn't established, because I feel as though we can't relate to others and we can't see where we are not correct in our actions, where we are distressing other people. And when we distress other people, that matters back to us. Some people say they don't care, but Russ Roberts, one of my favorite podcast hosts, he's an economist, and one of his favorite economists is Adam Smith, 17th century or 18th century economist from Ireland, who has this quote. He always says this quote: I believe it is man's desire is not only to be loved, but to be lovely. And we want to be good. We want to be someone that the community values. We want this. It's very embedded within the core of being a human being. This is my opinion. And so growth, empathy matters, because how people, what the idea, I've also heard this, people don't remember specific words or actions. They remember a general feeling of how you made them, how you made them feel. If you made them feel distressed, if you made them feel happy, if you made them feel sad, if you made them feel nervous, that's the overall, that's what people will remember from being with us. And so I really, it's of high value, and it's not easy, and it's not to say that I do this, but caring about other people's emotional well-being, it matters, because, like, I think we said this way earlier in the podcast, most of life's challenges today are not easy are nearly impossible to handle alone. Having a network, a support system behind us makes things a lot simpler, a lot easier. It makes the risks seem less risky. And so when, all that credibility, it's going to build up. These podcasts, they're going to build up the way we've spoken to people, the way we've treated people, what we've given to people, and what we've taken from people. That's all going to matter. I mean, those things on an individual level, but in the sense they all come together, and they are who we are, who we embody. And so just recognizing that, I think, brings a lot of growth, and recognizing, again, boundaries. You've said it a couple times. Boundaries is the only way I think boundaries is a sort of, people take it as selfishness, but it's inherently selfless. I don't want to say that. You know, if we want to be there for people who will be there for us, who will need us someday, we need to be ready. We need to be like fortified and strong and capable. And so, again, I'm not going to say that I practice this, and but this is my thinking. It requires being having boundaries, because we can't just let that empathy be just blatant and just go
Yeah.
on without control. And speak,
Yeah.
please, if you have
I
something.
just wanted to hone in on what you just did because it seems to be super important. Is like, we don't, like, I can speak for myself and maybe for both of us, we haven't yet attained the wisdom that we're speaking, or like the insight that we're bringing into words. We haven't yet fully integrated it. And sometimes, more often than not, the opportunity of emergent dialogue is to be able to speak that thing, to speak something new, to speak
Yeah.
something, uh, for me, for the first time often. And then it's become like seated in my field of possibility. And when you were talking about like, how the sum of each interaction and the sum of the work, the sum of the podcasts, there is a kind of mysterious law of attraction way in which I experience this whole thing. It's not really like I do X and then Y will happen. It's sort of like, if I am faithfully applying myself to it, then faithful and surprising outcomes will occur. And it's been really nice, even though my stuff is like pretty, my channel has like 200 subscribers, which feels pretty small, and I have some essays and so on. But occasionally, somebody in like an online community will like watch one of my things and just be super interested and go on like a dive into my archive, and then come back and say like, I watched all this stuff and it was really interesting. And then it feels like, oh, what I did 2 years ago hasn't been, just disappeared into the ether completely. But yeah, I mean, there's no way of telling the story without just getting into my own experience, which is that at the end of 2019, I really view that time as like the self that I was like slowly coming to an end.
Yes.
Because of the toxic relationship I was in with a person, but also in a sense with life, to be like onboarding all of this, to not have boundaries and to be in relationship with trauma is to onboard it. And so I had a very coherent ego that was sort of resting on top of a whole lot of incoherent stuff that wasn't integrated and wasn't reflected in any of my relationships, my friends, my family, and so on. And so when I came out of that whole toxic situation, there was also the realization of like, oh, like part of why this has occurred is my inability to communicate my own experience and the lack of any real understanding of this thing we call boundaries. Because, like you said, it has a negative connotation somehow. I think we think of boundaries as like the reaction of somebody who doesn't really have good boundaries who is now enforcing them. And this is what's brought up by the word boundaries. It's like, whoa, you're on my boundaries.
Yes. And they'll say it.
But that, right, that's sort of that's not the optimal understanding. I think there's when I went through my sort of journey of like thinking about it for the first time and like really like getting my own understanding of what it is, I started to feel that there is an art to this. And it's much
Wow.
more like in a biochemical sense of like different, like at the very foundational blocks of life, you have organisms that have integrity, structural integrity. They have a membrane, and insofar as they don't have that, they will like sort of dissolve and just be consumed by other things. And their capacity to form together with other blocks of life and then create more complex organisms like us comes out of those individual organisms having their own integrity. So that integrity for me is made up of that very subtle balance that occurs in every single interaction and relationship. And the learning journey of life is that uh, those possibilities of like moving more into coherence or out of coherence are like constantly presenting themselves. And so the practice then became saying the thing that would be uncomfortable to say that is true, or you know, if I'm like overwhelmed in a situation and I need to step out for a little bit and come back in because I am a very sensitive individual. Like I'm highly sensitive beyond normal, I would say. Um, to be able to do that and to like sort of smoothly do it or communicate that I'm going to do it. Like this was a super important thing with me and my current partner was like when I'm getting overwhelmed, being like, I need to go for a walk, and then going for a walk, and then coming back in a much better state. But, you know, there was a time in my life where I just wouldn't take that action. I would just move into a situation that was imbalanced, and then I would just dwell in it without skillful boundaries, and then be, um, yeah, onboarding that energy. So that's a little bit of a, um, yeah, insight into how I've come to reconsider what boundaries are, and it makes a huge difference. And it's actually the key to be able to actually be of service to people.
Yes.
And often with particularly with like Christian religious communities, which is also where I grew up in, there's a lot of like rescuing, there's a lot of savior complex kind of behaviors where people will take on another person who is sort of sinking whilst themselves not being able, like in such a way that reduces their overall integrity, sovereignty, coherence. But it's only from the place of sovereignty, integrity, and coherence that they can really be helpful. Because otherwise, you're just a person who's sinking, trying to help another person who's sinking, and you're both trying to help each other, and it's um, not gonna work out in the optimal way.
No, it's not. And those boundaries, I feel like the tradition, what we spoke about, what happens is that someone doesn't execute boundaries very well or in accordance with how it would probably work out for them. And then someone does come on and a drowning person does latch onto them, and then they're both drowning. And then while they're both drowning, the person starts to say, I need boundaries, and then cuts that person off. And then both of them start drowning because they're already so far deep that, yes. But, you know, boundaries aren't necessarily being, ignoring a person that is drowning. It's,
Mhm.
establishing systems that, in case that does happen, in a manner that you can actually address and that won't, you know, I don't know what to say. I don't want to say destroy, but impede our life. There are things we can take on, responsibilities we can take on that will be that when we leave them, we will be have exerted a lot of energy and a lot of time. And a lot of those things are frankly just not worth engaging in at all. And so establishing those boundaries is very important because we need to be able to recognize and have systematic processes to those people that say we're in a ocean and there's supplies everywhere. Well, if we set up boundaries, this is a bad analogy, I'm not even going to continue, but setting up boundaries and recognizing what's worthwhile and what we can't afford to take on for whatever reason. There are things, I like economy. I think of things in terms of an economist, and even when it comes to emotional well-being, I like to think of it in terms of a scale, an economical scale. There's a certain amount of emotional toll we can all take before it's too much. And we have to be very aware of where our limits are. For everyone, those limits are different too. And just being aware of where those limits are, setting the boundaries so we don't reach those limits, or reaching those limits become very difficult, then we won't be in that fight or flight mode so often for whatever reason, because we don't set boundaries, and then we allow these things, we allow ourselves to be too vulnerable, and then something, because we didn't set boundaries, takes a huge toll in our lives. It's that root that we keep axing down. But setting boundaries allows us to have the energy to just recognize things that need to change. It's hard to stop axing ourselves when we're trying to help someone else stop axing themselves, or when we're continually, engaging in things that don't really prosper us. Then, we need to just recognize where we can and can't
Yeah.
engage, and then take the actions further so that when we have to engage, it doesn't break us.
Yeah. I was feeling that the shift from like I'm gonna change someone or I need somebody to change, like that therein already is sort of one of the foundations of toxic relationship, is like I need this person to be different.
Yes.
And the shift from that to I need to just be in integrity with myself in relationship to that person, that is the sauce. And that has been really transforming my life for the last year. I'm finally reaching a place where I like have fucking like gotten through the clearing, and suddenly I don't feel like there's I don't feel a fear of being out of whack with my boundaries with
Dude,
relationships in my life anymore. um though yeah, it's not just um there's so many layers to this. It's not just something that's being set, it's something that we're constantly sensing into as well. It could be shifting. And, for me, that integrity is to be able to name what I'm experiencing and bring it out into the shared space. And often what happens is when we can't communicate, which that's me, that's a lot of autistically dispositioned people and so on, to not be able to communicate what we're experiencing, and then to be actually sensitive to something in our environment, in other people that they are not aware of, that they are unconscious of, and we're sensitive to it, then it comes into us. And insofar as we're not able to name it and like keep that coherence between the inside and the outside, then that unconscious material is all just coming in. Whatever like maladaptive stuff, it's all coming in, it's loading on. But when we can like be in coherent relationship with it and name it, not like attack it, but just be like, this is what I'm experiencing right now. This is what this is what I feel. That actually creates the boundary. So that the boundary is being alchemized through words. Yeah.
Yes. And it, like we said earlier, finding the right diction and speaking what we actually mean to say, along with being empathetic, allows us to relate to the other person and will allow us to communicate our boundaries to them with more ease. And I feel, most people that we work with, again, we have to be empathetic because we have to understand other people's boundaries as well. Because when we breach those boundaries, they know it, they feel it, and it's a feeling. It's not a specific small things. It's more of a big picture when it comes to people. At least that's my thinking about it. And if we continually breach someone's boundaries, they're gonna have a less than optimal view of us. And that's not what we want. We want to be lovely. We want to be loved and we want to be lovely. And so, being, I'm sorry, what was your point? What did you say?
I mean, merely the subtlety of like what we can name somehow is really key to it. And if there's something present that is affecting us, but we can't bring it into words, then that can be that's like a sort of key to these creating these boundaries.
Yes.
Or just
And
creating coherence, just setting aside boundaries, like coherence between inside and outside effectively.
which are boundaries, which, because if we have none boundaries, there's just going to be incoherence. And so recognizing other people's, recognizing our own, and adjusting our actions for both, it's optimal. And I think another thing is, I forgot what I wanted to say, but it matters. And if we want to progress and grow and find these avenues and do things, things are everything's nearly impossible to do alone, almost everything. So making people feel good with the way that they interact with you is a huge deal. And even for the most technical people or the least technical people, it matters significantly. In the long run, it matters. In the short run, maybe it won't matter. Maybe it won't. But if we continually act out of accordance with people's boundaries, just no one will come to support us if we ever need it, if we ever call for it. And it matters. Keeping on the right side of boundaries.
Yeah. And the last piece, I feel we're sort of reaching a natural close now, but to sort of speak more to the tools of this, like there are tools and practices that people listening to this can go to. Call them psychotechnologies, technologies of the psyche, tools of the psyche. We go to the gym to keep our bodies fit and feeling good. We can go to these wisdom gyms of dialogue, of transformative dialogue practice, which is has been my project and my mission.
Yes.
Is to create a really sensitively attuned space that is just conducive to learning and conducive to people developing the capacity to transform conversation, which is basically the core of all relationship. So, and then there's other things like circling. I don't know if you've ever heard of circling, but this is a really big worldwide practice, came out of San Francisco. And it's sort of like a social meditation where you practice with another person and you just practice things like observing, oh, like this is what I'm sensing in this moment. And is this true for you? And just like working at this very foundational level, these skills can be super transformative. I feel like I've only dipped my toes in. I feel like there's many years of new dimensions to this to open up, and it feels like a lifelong journey, lifelong practice that is becoming meaningful work for me, but ultimately is gonna outlive the work because I'll always be having conversations whilst I'm in this earthly form.
I've said it better. It's practicing, reading, writing, speaking with others.
Thank you, Karish.
Thank you, Jacob.